So with Pesach just about a week or so away, I have been on the lookout for interesting topics in halacha that relate to Pesach that I might want to talk about, that I might want to discuss, speak about. Which is why we're going to be speaking right now about birth control. Now, I can hear you asking, how does that follow from what I just said? How did we get from Pesach to birth control? And the answer is that while I was looking through various tshuvas, svarim, for interesting discussions relating to Pesach, I happened to stumble upon an interesting tshuva, or tshuvas, interesting discussion regarding birth control. And it just so happens that the tshuva, or as we shall see, perhaps even tshuvas, that I want to discuss are actually dated with today's date, Monday. Today's date was Hey Nisan. And these tshuvas were written in Hey Nisan about 60 years ago. And I figure if those Rabbanim had nothing better to discuss a few days, a week before Pesach, than the topic of birth control, Menias Hiroyan, then so can I. We can also discuss this very topic around this time. And at any rate, it's what you might call a perennial topic. Kol yom v'yom zimneu. Every day, this is a topic that is relevant and applicable and relates to many people's lives. And it's probably a topic that we're all interested in learning more about. So we're going to jump in. I'm going to start with a tshuva in Chalkas Yaakov. I've mentioned Chalkas Yaakov a number of times in the past. Most recently, I believe, in one of these shiurim recorded here. So I'm not going to repeatedly introduce him, but the author is Mordechai Yaakov Breish, who was a Rav in Switzerland, in Zurich, Zurich, and he is one of the Chashva Paiskim. The Shalos Tshuvas Chalkas Yaakov is one of the Chashva Shalos Tshuvas of the post-war era. And in the original edition, each sefer included new tshuvas that he had written. So this was printed in Chelik Gimel, Siman Samach Beis. I believe Chelik Gimel was printed in the year Tafshin Chavav, so around 1966. As I've mentioned before, Chalkas Yaakov has been reprinted and reorganized by Chaim Yeridei Even Ezer Shemishpa. So today, in the newer edition, it's in Chalkas Yaakov Chelik Gimel, Even Ezer, Siman Samach Aleph. The number is only moved over by one. It used to be Chelik Gimel, Siman Samach Beis. Now it's Chelik Gimel, Even Ezer, Siman Samach Aleph. And we find a very interesting tshuva that he wrote, addressed L'chvoid Gavra Rabbi V'Yakira Harav Agoyin, etc. Rabbi Yaakov HaKoyin Shedaita Yofe Yechuna Zaltzer Rav La Adosai Adas Yeshurun Be'ir Johannesburg Be'Afrika Hadreimis. So this is written to a Rabbi Yaakov Saltzer, who's a Rav of the community Adas Yeshurun in Johannesburg, South Africa. Looked him up a bit. You can look him up as well. He was in fact the Rav of this Yekishe, very German Kehila that was founded in Johannesburg, South Africa in the 1900s, earlier part of the 1900s. And he was a Rav there throughout the early decades of the second half of the 1900s. And he's a name who's crops up in different Shalos Tshuvas, Chalkas Yaakov, etc. And this is one such case. And what's interesting is that the Chalkas Yaakov actually quotes the Shaila that Rabbi Saltzer sent him back to him for our benefit, so we can see what the question was. And so Rabbi Breish writes that you wrote to me that the local newspapers have been making this great deal out of the fact that doctors in England have invented the pill for birth control to prevent pregnancies, and it's already being put to great use. And a local doctor here in South Africa told me, Rabbi Saltzer, that the way these pills work is that they interrupt the cycle, and the woman therefore cannot become pregnant. And the doctor added his medical opinion, told Rabbi Saltzer, that he, at this point, is still not recommending that women use these pills for a prolonged amount of time, because there hasn't been enough research, there haven't been enough studies, hasn't been proven sufficiently that there might not be any harmful side effects for the woman's health from using these pills for a sustained amount of time. So this doctor in particular, at this point, is only recommending to use them in emergency situations, and even in those cases, only for a very limited amount of time. So what are we talking about? Let's just pause here for a second. So this tshuva is dated Hey Nissen Tafshin Chav Beis. So that's 1962, like I said, basically about 61 years ago. And I did want to go cross-reference check the timeline of the pill to see how it lines up and to see if I understand what Rabbi Salzer is talking about. So if you look it up online, you'll actually find online there are some detailed timelines of the development of the pill, of course, celebrated by many. So they're very happy to share the precise details, the precise timeline of how the pill was developed. And it's a long story. We're not going to get into all of that. But what we need to know for the purposes of this discussion is, and I'm going to quote from a shorter timeline from The Guardian. The Guardian writes from an article in 2007, the pill, a combination of the hormones estrogen and progestin, was developed in the US in the 1950s by the American biologist Dr. Gregory Pincus. It was approved for release in 1960, and take-up was swift. Within 2 years, it was being used by 1.2 million American women. It was introduced in the UK on the NHS, the NHS, of course, being the British healthcare system. Introduced in the UK on the NHS in 1961 for married women only. This lasted until 1967, and is now taken by however many women in Britain, etc. So that's the history that's relevant to our discussion. So I'm not sure what precisely Rabbi Salzer meant when he said that it was invented by doctors in England. Not sure what that's about. The pill, as we know it, the famous pill, this, like we said, the tshuva was written in Nisan, the beginning of 1962. So this seemingly tracks with the development and introduction of the pill to the wider public as a birth control method around this time, 1960, 1961, and that means that this shaila, hasn't literally just been invented the other day, but it is a fairly early question and discussion regarding this topic, so pretty close to the beginning, and sounds like it's somewhat of news to Rabbi Breish himself. Rabbi Salzer is informing him, letting him know, telling him what the story is, and now halacha has to express, the halachic authorities have to express an opinion about this new phenomenon. And Rabbi Salzer continues and says, now that we know that, what's happening is, he's a Rav of a community, and now Nashim Ksheris, good firm women, who were told by their doctors, advised by their doctors to take the pill, are now crowding my door. They're asking, can we get the heter? Can we have the heter to take the pill? And the reason why we don't want to do that is if the doctor's saying that there's a reason, the doctor's saying that it's dangerous, so that means the doctor is essentially saying that we ought not to get pregnant. So that's the first thing the doctor is saying is don't get pregnant. And then the doctor is suggesting that in order to avoid that, you take the pill. That way, you can continue living with your husband, kederach kol haaretz, even during the time when the doctor says you can't get pregnant. Otherwise, you won't get pregnant, but you also can't live a normal married life. So that's what the pill would be solving. That would be the help, the benefit. Now the question is, though, that there's a large range of situations in which doctors are saying that women shouldn't get pregnant. Sometimes it might be actual physical danger, real cause of concern. But there are some cases in which, ein chas v'shalom sakana mamish, we wouldn't say that it's direct physical harm, like chalishus, teshishas koyach, ayefus klolus, atzbonus, different terms for exhaustion, tiredness, nerves, having the births too close together. The mother is nursing a little baby, a few months old, and it's hard to take care of two little children and while being pregnant, and tinnitus like that, arguments like that. And when you come to the doctor with this argument, the doctors will say, okay, sure, don't get pregnant for a certain amount of time, or maybe even long term. He says, legamre. And the women that are asking they're nisharis bekalas kabachamurus. We're talking about from women that are looking to do the right thing, and they're asking the Rav now, what's the story? We need to know what the halacha is in the new reality that we live in today, the reality, the world after the pill. And would it at least be mutter for some kind of limited amount of time until their situation improves? And that's the question Rabbi Salzer sent to Rabbi Breish. Rabbi Breish says, and now you've unloaded this problem at my door. It's on my shoulders. I have to now answer this tough question. And I think, speaking myself, I think this shuvah from Rabbi Breish is instructive in that, first of all, like I said, we get to see the pretty immediate response to this new question arriving on the scene, but also just in the way that he goes about answering and the various points and themes that he hits. And it's an interesting discussion. And the first thing he does is by really giving a little musar shmooze, which probably won't be unfamiliar. It's the kind of message we probably do tend to hear a lot within our world, the frum world. So the first point that Rabbi Breish makes before he gets to discussing the halacha, discussing a tatum, he says, my dear friend, it's very difficult, very, very difficult to get involved, to intervene from a distance in matters like this, because often the question isn't fully on the level. They're not being so truthful and honest in how they present the question. And the doctors often exaggerate, they take it very far, very fast, because to the doctors, they don't care, it's not a big deal to them. Skip a pregnancy, avoid pregnancy, who cares? Why not? So for the slightest pretext, they're willing to say, sure, there's danger, whatever you say. So in these types of situations, Rabbi Breish says, you really have to investigate and find out what the truth really is, even when they say that it's a danger. Especially if they're not even saying what the danger is. And what's really happening is that the women and the men simply don't want to have many children. And so here's where he essentially addresses and tackles the concept of family planning, in distinction from a situation, as we'll see, in which the woman or the husband and wife are very overwhelmed right now at the moment, and they need a breather, they need a break. That's one level, but beyond that, you have those that simply going into marriage, going into the situation, they are thinking about how many children they'd ideally like to have for the lifestyle they would like to live. Within Chabad, obviously, we're familiar with the Rebbe Sikha, where the Rebbe emphasizes this point. And whenever the topic of birth control comes up in Lubavitch conversations, I do like to point out that, to the best of my understanding, the Rebbe's real emphasis, main emphasis in that Sikha and the relating correspondence, I know it's been written up that there was a context, I think also perhaps from South Africa, but I think a bit later, around 1980, the Rebbe was asked about this, and the Rebbe addressed it. But the way I read it, the way I see it, is that the Rebbe was focusing, especially and particularly, on that mindset where your finances are decent, your life is decent, and you simply don't want to be bothered, and that's what the Rebbe is addressing, attacking, or maybe that's a harsh word, but that's really what the Rebbe is focusing on, and that's what the Rabbi Breish is focusing on here as well. Whereas once you start venturing into territory beyond that, where there might be not an outright sakana, but the couple isn't coping, that's not really the thing. I'm not saying the Rebbe didn't say something that could be applied perhaps even to a larger variety of cases. But if you look at the Sikha, this is just a Maimer HaMuzgar, my opinion is that we have to really distinguish between situations, and that the Rebbe's message, as he presented it, was really focusing on what Rabbi Breish is focusing on here, where the family simply has it all worked out as to how many children they want or what kind of life they want to live, and they don't want to have all this tsar Iber, tsar Leda, tsar Gidul Banam, continuing now in the tshuva again. And now the Chalkas Yaakov says, "Ve'enei doime leYehudis devisu de Reb Chia," and don't say that that's the same kind of tsar that Reb Chia's wife was experiencing. So what's this reference that he's making? He's making a reference to what would be the classic source in Gemara to address the situation. Let's take a look for a moment. It's Yevamis, Daf Samachem at Beis, where the Mishnah of the Gemara are talking about the period of Eriviyat. And the Gemara says, Yehuda v'Chizkiya ta'oimim hoyu. Echad nigbarat surasi l'seif tisha, v'echad nigbarat surasi l'tchilas shiva. Yehuda and Reb Chia's sons, Yehuda and Chizkiya, were twins, but Gemara says that they gestated at the same time. They overlapped in the mother's womb, but one was born at 9 months, and one was born at 7 months. I think I've heard before that it's a question, it's a discussion, what the science says about that type of situation. But that's what the Gemara says. The Gemara says that there was some kind of abnormal situation involving twins, but not being born at the same time. And it was just unusual, it was unpleasant. So the Gemara says, Yehudis, Dvisu de Rabchia's wife, and it says her name. I think that's unusual. I've pointed out before, there actually are many wives that are quoted in Gemara. If we made a list of the wives, it would be a rather long list, but very few whose names are stated. But here it says, Rabchia's wife, Yehudis. Havlat Sar Leda, so she's the wife, she's the mother. She had Sar Leda from this whole situation. Birthing pain. So, Shanai Mana, she changed her clothing, she disguised herself, and she appeared before her husband to ask him a shaila, but she disguised herself and he didn't recognize that it was her. And she asked Reb Chia, and she told Reb Chia the story, and she said the situation. And she asked, or she just asked outright, it's a mefakta, pir v'rivya. Is a woman commanded on the mitzvah? The fact that, I'm not appreciating this, it's not pleasant for me, I'd rather avoid having children. Am I doing something wrong? Am I chayiv in pir v'rivya, or am I not chayiv? So, when asked the question out of context, wasn't without knowing that it's actually really very, very relevant to his own married life. He said, no, it happens to be that pir v'rivya is a chiv on the man, not on the woman. You're not having pir v'rivya. So Azla, the Gemara says, Ishtiya sama da karta. So she went and she drank a potion that made her infertile. She became an akara. We know this is mentioned throughout Chazal, even in, I don't know if it's stated outright in Tanakh, but maybe Chazal tied it into different stories in Tanakh. A kois shel ikrim, this concept of drinking something, taking a pill that makes one infertile permanently. So, but the problem is that the whole Maisa was only due to this unusual pregnancy, and she hadn't understood what was going on. She had given birth, presumably, and the other child hadn't been born yet, and she just felt very unpleasant, and she was unaware that she was still expecting the other half of her twins. And then they found out, either that, or even the Glai Milsa, they found out what she did, and then Rabbi said, "Hey, I wish you would have given me another set of twins." Right? Interesting story. The Gemara goes on to discuss, really, is that true? Women are not chayim pir v'rivya. But the Gemara, the way the Gemara describes it, it sounds like Reb Chia's wife got a heter from her very own husband, unbeknownst to him, quite easily, seemingly, to go on the pill permanently, essentially. Some ancient version of the pill that had permanent effects. And why? Because she had Tsar Leda. So Rabbi Ibrahim is now trying to bavar and address, you're going to say, you're giving me musar and saying, I don't like Tsar Leda, you just don't want Tsar Leda. That's the mice in the Gemara. The Gemara says that she didn't like Tsar Leda. She says, no, it's not the same thing. Because of this unique situation with the twins and the 7 months, the 9 months, that must have been a Tsar Gadol Umoid. So even though it may not be fully explicit in the Gemara, but we have to assume, we have to interpret that she had Tsar Leda off the charts. And that's not the case in these typical situations that we're discussing now. It says here, they want to continue having an active married life. They just want to avoid the consequences, which is children. Then the Chalkas Yaakov cites the Gemara Nida. Gemara Nida refers to the practice in the Middle East in ancient times, or maybe even in some very, very traditional pockets of the Middle East till today, where even young women who had not yet reached adulthood were still seen as eligible for marriage. And the Gemara alludes to the fact that some people perhaps preferred that, perhaps specifically because they knew they were not at an age where they can have children. So you get to have all the fun, quote unquote, without the consequences. And the Gemara says that people that have that attitude are delaying Mashiach. Again, back then, it was considered normal, etc., etc. But the issue the Gemara raises is that Amen Dovid ba ad sheyichlu kol neshama shebaguf. The idea is you're supposed to be trying to bring as many children, as many people into the world as possible, and that, the Gemara says, is linked to bringing Mashiach. So when your attitude is, how can I somehow have an active married life and avoid the children, the Gemara is saying that ma'akvad is a Mashiach. Of course, at the time of the Gemara, it was a slightly different scenario, but it should be applicable here as well. And in fact, he says it's a kol shekain. Here, the woman is capable of having children, and yet you're going out of your way to prevent it from happening. And then Rabbi makes a bit of an emotional appeal. He says, very, very unfortunately, after the great Holocaust, the great destruction, and we saw how families that were unbelievably large, mishpachas gedolos va'atzumos, and Nebuch after the Holocaust, what was left out of the whole family tree? Maybe just one young child, a katan shebehem, the last child they had, perhaps, the youngest one. And he says, that child, if they had birth control, that might have been the child that they would have decided, you know what, we had enough, let's skip that one. That was the one who survived the Holocaust, he says. Is that something you want to mess with, he says? So he says, before we get to the halacha, you have to think of these consequences. It's what we call meta-halachic, etc., the kind of question of what effect will this have on Yiddishkeit? What effect will this have on our community? What effect will this have on families? Before you get to the technical shaila, yeah, no. It's a bigger question than that. And therefore, both the parents, the couples, and the rabbanim who have to give a psak, they have to approach this very, very seriously and think about these upshots, these consequences. What happens when you eliminate the ability to get pregnant? Because who knows what could be born from every pregnancy? Mi yamid b'cheker Hashem v'keira hadeiros morosh. Who knows what we might be missing out on due to birth control? And he repeats, again, very often there's no real issue. It's just about we want to up our quality of life. And perhaps he says the woman doesn't want to accept Hashem's gzeira, be'etzev tel dibanim, doesn't want to deal with the pain, the suffering. Then he makes another emotional argument. He says, think about it. Parents who have children, the children they already have, they'll do anything for them. They'll give anything for them. Your children are priceless. And then just to decide not to have children is such a light decision. You take the decision so lightly. Think about it the same way. Think about what you would give for your children. They're your potential children. And it would be a great shame if it was just some somewhat silly reason, just the desire to have a better life. You're going and doing itzis with achbulas to prevent the unborn from being born. He says, Mi yedea kama gedolim ba'anshe mas nevdelu sibazu. Who knows how many gedolim, how many askanim, etc. we've lost due to this. Muvas shelo yuchal litaken. Nothing you can do about it. You can never bring those people back. He says that another argument, the living conditions of our ancestors was certainly not nearly as good. Didn't have the cleanliness and the hygiene, which I guess is alluding to perhaps some of the language people use when they want to justify why they don't feel like having such a large family would be ideal. He says the hygiene was much worse back then, and we're being ingrateful to the Eibishter, towards Hashem, who gave us. We live in much larger apartments now, much cleaner, hygienic. If anything, this is the ultimate time in history. If you have to choose a time in history for being able, having the ability to raise the largest family possible, that would be today, more than our ancestors could have. And then we get a moment here of self-awareness. He says, I'm aware that I've gone on at length with some very sharp words, because I do feel very bad about this pirza and various from communities that he says are imitating Hamode ha'arura b'tzarfas. You're imitating the fashion, the cursed fashion in France. That's how he puts it. And I believe I've mentioned before, perhaps it was last year, tshuva and the Sgan. We brought it up in a different context, but the Sgan was discussing a situation in which a shaykhit in a town and his wife, she stopped going to the mikveh. They were living together, but she stopped going. And as I mentioned at the time, this seems like an earlier, before birth control was really invented in a systematic way. This is perhaps the 1920s, the 1930s. You were already seeing people were more of a mind, were more consciously seeking to have some form of birth control. And This is obviously not something that was literally invented overnight in 1960, 61, 62. And it seems like that's why the Chalkos Yaakov already has much to say on the topic. But like we said, this is still coming pretty soon after this next development in the history of birth control, specifically the pill. So that's the first thing he has to say. But that shouldn't color your impression of this whole tshuva, because the rest of the tshuva goes in a completely different direction. And now he says, can't put everyone in the same box, not everyone's in the same category. And if the doctors say there is a sakana, and it looks like they're not exaggerating, surely, we definitely got to look for a heter. And he says, in fact, I've discussed this before. If you look in my Chalkos Yaakov Chelik Beis, my previous volume, Siman Yud Aleph, the Beis Yud Gimel, I gave Eitz Shainis. And if you go look it up, so it's a tshuva from a bit less than a decade earlier, in the mid-50s, in which he discusses the birth control methods of the day and goes through this topic from various angles. So like he says, it's been discussed before. This is not completely new. But now, okay, now we have these new pills. So if we had to choose, based on all the different suggestions and methods that we had until now, compared to this new one, he says, he says, in fact, this would probably be the best one, because the Gemara talks about drinking a potion that makes you infertile, and this is much better. This is this is just temporary. It's just as long as you take the pill. And then he adds, by the way, here in Switzerland, we have pills that are being brought from America that work in a similar way. So it's pshita that if there is a real need to be mater birth control, that would be the best type. So now the Chalkos Yaakov is conceded, of course, for the Makom Sakana, all for it. Now he moves on to the gray area, the middle. Gam b'makom she'ein sakana, but any Dayan Yenoyes, the Rav, the Dayan, sees that those asking for a heter are not simply looking to make their life easier, or just to avoid the task of raising children. Kamatzav kazeh, the yuchal etzmeach mizeh, sakana is suffix sakana. The situation is such that it can lead to some kind of danger or the concern of a danger, and seemingly he's alluding back to the only other instance that was cited in the Shiloh was, like we said, ayefus, chishus, atzbonos. So that's seemingly what he's referring back to now and using these words to describe that. So it's not an immediate concern, but there's some concern. So he cites a tshuva Rabbi Akiva Eger, legabe Shabbos, Hilchos Shabbos, Pikuach Nefesh. The question is, what standard of concern of Pikuach Nefesh do we apply when it comes to being Mechal Shabbos? So Dr. Rabbi Akiva Eger, there's a famous line in a Gemara in Shabbos, but let's quote the fuller context. The Gemara in Shabbos, Tafim Heim and Aleph says, Bo minei de Rav, they asked Rav, Mal taltuli Shraga de Chanukta mikame chabari b'shabta. So we know from the Gemara that there was a group in Bavel, in the world of the Amoraim and Bavel, who they lived in Persia, and Persia was under the religion, the reigning religion in Persia at the time, the Persian Empire, was Zoroastrianism, which is its own very interesting ancient religion. It's still somewhat around in Iran till today. And the Gemara alludes here, maybe elsewhere as well, that there was some kind of issue, some kind of concern in which if the Jews were to have their Hanukkah candles, Hanukkah lights, really, Hanukkah lamp, as I believe I've discussed in the Hanukkah shiur earlier this year. So the Hanukkah lamp were to be out in public, were to be visible, the chabare, which is usually explained to be the Zoroastrian fire priests, they would take issue with the fact that whatever the Jews were doing with the fire had its own significance to them, and they would be offended. And it could be a sakana. And it's its own interesting topic. I've looked into it. We're not going to get into all that right now. There is a Zoroastrian fire festival that's celebrated in Iran till today. Very interesting stuff. At any rate, the assumption is that there are these chabare. The chabare don't like seeing our Shraga, the Chanukah. They don't like seeing our Hanukkah lamp. So it's Shabbos and the chabare are around and the Shraga, the Chanukah is out. Can we carry it on Shabbos due to this concern? So they asked Rav. Rav told them, Shaper Dami, Shasat Chak Shaini, it's Shasat Chak. And they said, Zoi, Hachi Ilchasa. Others asked, so Rav said, Kedayu Reb Shimon Lismech Olav B'Shas Hadchak. Right, it's a famous line, Kedayu Reb Shimon. So Reb Shimon has a specific shitta that would make the shaila of moving it less of a shaila anyway. So even if perhaps you wouldn't pass him like Reb Shimon, but B'Shas Hadchak, you can rely on Reb Shimon. That's what the Gemara says. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger comes and asks a question. Rabbi Akiva Eiger asks, we're talking about a sakana. Don't we always say when there's a sakana, it could be doich and isser? So why are we looking for a shita to be saimech and Reb Shimon? It's a sakana. It could be aser, but it's mutter anyway. So Zok Rabbi Akiva Eiger Muzman Zagan al Karchach the Ein Kanata Begader Safek Sakana Lahatu Isser B'Shul Zeh. We actually have not reached the usual bar of a suffix sakana. There is no active, imminent suffix sakana that would be enough to be matir and isser. We don't just go around being over on isurim due to some remote concern that something might happen. There has to be something concrete. And yet, obviously, if we're asking the question, so we have some concern, some faint level of concern. So tzad arichuk, histafas sakana. Mikri shas adchak. It might not be called the shas sakana, but it's called the shas adchak. And for that situation, Rabbi Akiva Eiger says, okay, so we rely on Reb Shimon. So it's not quite the sakana that's doich and isser, but we are sensitive to even lesser degrees of sakana, and we might be looking for heterim. So we can make an analogy to here. If the dayan sees that this is a shas adchak, not a shas sakana, it's a shas adchak. Okay, so it's a shas adchak. Then we can start being matter things. We can start relying on things that might be inherently not completely aser. And like we saw already in Gemara Yavamis, that Tzara Leda, you could drink a kais ikrin. So Ibazoi, this is there, your mamish being the saris the isha, you're taking away the woman's ability to have children at all. So here that's not doing that, it's just kadurim, just pills. So shas adchak, surely you can be matir these kadurim, these pills. And now all of a sudden the Chalkas Yaakov discloses, right, until now we've been taken very seriously. A woman to prevent herself from having children, it's very serious. So the Chalkas Yaakov, by the way, I don't know if I mentioned yet, we're mentioning this Gemara Yavamis, a woman, he says if you look, Rambam, Tur, Shulchan Aruch, Siman Hey, Even Ezer, Siman Hey, so let's take a look. Look in Even Ezer, Siman Hey, Shulchan Aruch. So you're not allowed to be mashka, koshel ikrim, to a person, to an animal. This is in Siman Hey, which we've discussed before, But at the end of Sifri Beis it says, Isha muteras lishtois ikrin kedei lesarsa ad shalei teled. This language is taken from the Rambam and Yisur Bia Perek Tezayin, where the Rambam wrote the same thing. A woman is permitted to drink a potion to cause her to lose her ability to have children, so that she will not conceive. So, mamash and often halacha, essentially, that a woman can go nuclear on birth control. Mitzad, just isser v'heter, the woman, is she doing something that's not allowed to her body? No, a woman has, you could say, full control over her body, and she can, if she wants to never have children again, Torah says, go ahead, green light. That's the simple reading of the Rambam, Torah, and Shulchan Aruch. So we're going to mention that now. We're getting around to mentioning that, by the way, that's actually what it says in Shulchan Aruch. And it's only the Bach and the Marshal, Bach on the Torah, and the Marshal and the Yam Shel Shleima, who pull back a bit and say, no, wait, we don't think that's how we would put it. We're machmir, unless there's tsar leda. So they qualify it and bring it back to what it sounds like from the Gemara, that there has to be some kind of basis, some kind of pretext, tsar leda. And now the Chalkas Yaakov quotes a very interesting thing from the Yam Shel Shleima, and this is interesting in general, even beyond the discussion here. The Yam Shel Shleima mentions the following point. When we said he's one who is machmir, but also is mater when this tsar leda. The Yam Shel Shleima adds, "The kol shekeinim boneha ein holchem b'derech yishara." If the woman's children that she already has are not going on the right path, she feels like whatever her family situation, whatever her life situation is, she doesn't feel capable of producing good children, and all the children so far have been going off the derech. And she's concerned that why bring more of this into the world? Why would I want to continue? Why would I want to increase and bring more of this? That would be a good reason. Even the Marshal, who's more stringent and says there has to be a reason, but if he's looking for a reason, he's willing to accept as a legitimate reason that the woman just feels that bringing more children is just not going to be a good outcome. And the Chalkas Yaakov adds, in parentheses, the obvious question here would be, there's a famous Gemara in Brachas, where Chizkiah refused to get married altogether. And Yeshai asked Chizkiah, why are you not getting married? And Chizkiah said, I see that my children aren't going to be good children. And Yeshai tells Chizkiah, why is that your business of what the future will be? So how can the Marshal say this? So Zok the Marshal, Zok the Chalkas Yaakov, Efshad the Hasam Shiny, Mishum the Adayan Lekiyam Mitzvahs Pirivir. Maybe the distinction is that Chizkiah didn't get married; he was avoiding the Mitzvah Pirivir altogether, and that's of course a topic we discussed earlier this year, the centrality of Mitzvah Pirivir. Whereas here, the Marshal, the case that the Marshal is discussing is a case in which she seems to have somewhat of a sizable family. So we assume they were Mekayim, the couple was Mekayim Pirivir. And now she feels like, what's the point of continuing? And it's not a steer from the Gemara, and the Marshal says, then it's fine. And that's the Marshal being more stringent. I want to pause here and the Chalkas Yaakov, because this is a very interesting point. And this is also, we talk about the Rebbe Sichos and what scenarios the Rebbe was talking about. Again, like I emphasized, like I said, I think the Rebbe's main point was the same target that the Chalkas Yaakov was targeting, which is families that are just looking to have it easier. Of course, not to be dismissive towards people's concerns, but within the broader scheme of things and the range of reasons that people have, some are heavier, more serious, and some are less. And the Chalkas Yaakov and the Rebbe as well would be addressing that. So other questions one has is, what would the Rebbe say? What would others say in situations? So like we began this Shuvah, what if the family is overwhelmed, the parents, not necessarily the children, but the parents are overwhelmed? And what if the parents are or not, but the whole family situation is a disaster? What if it's clearly not a functioning family, it's a dysfunctional family, we see the children already on the scene are not thriving or not doing well? And then, of course, beyond that, you have, of course, if there are literal health problems, the children that were born have existing health problems, and there's concern that would apply. So I want to pause for a moment from the Chalkas Yaakov to elaborate on this point. And as we see, there's a very valuable source here from the Marshal. So I want to interject with a treatment discussion I found of this more particular topic. It's in a work called Shiur Tshuvas Ba'ala Shel Torah, Volume 6, on Even Ezer Choshen Mishpat by Rav Yaakov Ariel in Ramat Gan. So this is, I suppose you could say, moving out of Haredi territory into, I suppose, perhaps Dati Leumi territory. And the way the frum world is today, there's a lot of, I don't know if segregation is the right word, compartmentalization or another better word, but the frum world at this point is kind of divided into a number of communities that aren't necessarily fully communicating with each other on halachic topics, and each group develops its own list of authorities and literature. But it is important to keep up with what others are writing, and as we know, a lot of these ideas are percolating within various communities. But just to point out that sometimes the Dati Leumi community is coming from a different angle, looking at things a bit differently. And the presentation here might also sound that way, but at least not that I am not that I consider myself a major authority, not that I'm throwing any authority behind it, but I do think that I do find that the logic here does resonate. So I'm going to share what Rabbi Yaakov Ariel writes in this Ba'ala Shel Torah Chelik Vav, it's actually Siman Aleph, regarding having children with some kind of defect. And his main question, his chief question really is about the genetic situation, right? As we know, unfortunately, here in America today, we have Dur Yesharim, which was built on the bitter experience of some families who discovered that both parents were carriers for certain genetic diseases, which some of their children were born with and suffered tremendously, and Dur Yesharim is designed to prevent that from happening. But still, we hear of situations, of cases where somehow, for whatever reason, the situation is such that a couple is aware at this point that due to circumstances, genetic testing has proven that future children will have in the future are likely or or perhaps even guaranteed to be born with terrible, terrible defects, whether physical or mental. So in any situation where that is a concern, what do we say about the chiyuv and mitzvahs pir v'rivya? There might be different opinions. This is presenting a particular way of thinking about it. So Rabbi Ariel actually begins with that Gemara in Brachas. The Gemara in Brachas seems to be ground zero for saying it's not your business. Hashem decides. Hashem wants you to have children, and whatever happens later is I guess Hashem's problem. It's Hashem's decision. But Rabbi Ariel immediately pivots by quoting this Marshal, the Marshal Yam Shoshlemi Yavamis. Well, let's quote the portion of the Marshal. Isha eina mitzuva al pir v'rivya v'yachaya lishtas kais shel ikrin heicha de isla tsar leda. So the Marshal immediately qualifies, which is why the Chakos Yaakov listed him as being more machmer. Heicha de isla tsar leda. And here's the quote that we quoted: Shemisyara b'pnei banim she'enim hagunim. And then again, the Marshal says, Ish is mitzvah pir v'rivya, not the Isha. And again, Mataras lishtas kais shel ikrin. Smag writes it based on the Gemara in Yavamis. And he says there are those who went further. We shouldn't go that far to say any woman like the case in the Gemara. And again, that was the quote we saw before. So the Marshal is reiterating, and he's being very clear that this is his stance. So what are you going to do now with the Gemara in Brachas? So you can make a distinction and say Chizkiah is a man, he's chayv in pir v'rivya, he has no excuse. But the Marshal is talking about the woman, and the context was Ish mechuyev, Isha p'tura. So she's p'tura. She's not obligated to have children that are not going to lead to a good outcome, and so on in this vein of explaining how the Gemara doesn't apply to what we're discussing here. And then Rabbi Ariel goes on and makes another argument, which I think is also important, and he says that you could still ask, doesn't the child have a right to live? Doesn't the child have a right to exist? Do we have the right, should we feel that we should take away this child's ability to be brought into the world? So Rabbi Ariel says, no, even from the child's perspective, yesh leimar, there's no mitzvah to bring someone into the world. Again, he's talking about more serious medical situations. To bring someone into the world who will suffer so much and be completely dependent on others and not be able to live a meaningful, independent life. And if you're looking to say it in more halachic terms, there's a chiyuv, there's a chayv, there's a mitzvah, what's the gather? So he says, on the one hand, it looks like there's a mitzvah to bring a child into the world. On the other hand, he says, I already proved in a previous volume of Ba'ala Shal Torah Chelik Beis, I proved that a person is potter from a mitzvah saseh if it causes him great pain. So if you look it up, the discussion there is not so esoteric. It's just talking about someone who's very sick, and Sukkot comes, Yom Tov comes, different just timely mitzvahs say, and sometimes people have the instinct they want to knock themselves out, go above and beyond, even at great risk to themselves to do the mitzvah. But halacha is usually mitzvah, potter, etc. That's the discussion there. That Stam mitzvah say, we're not talking about mitzvah leis, we're talking about mitzvah say. If mitzvah say is going to cause you great yisurim, it seems seemingly reasonable to say that you're potter if doing the mitzvah say will cause you great yisurim. So Rabbi Ariel says, so let's look at the father's chiyuv. The father's a chiyuv of pir v'rivya. What if being mekayim pir v'rivya would cause the father great yisurim? Mistaber, that we'd potter the father. And he invokes the word, the Dracha d'Archinayim, which I believe I spoke about once, different Gedarim and Dracha d'Archinayim. So he says, if this is correct, if our assumption is correct, that we can find the Hechatimtza, which the father would say the father's potter from Pir V'Rivya, because it's causing great Yisurim. So Abazai, it should also apply from the child's end. That there's no mitzvah to, if the whole end point, the whole result of the mitzvah will be a child's existence of suffering, that's not the mitzvah, or the mitzvah, you're potter from the mitzvah, from resulting in something like that. And he acknowledges, of course, we know that all human beings suffer to one extent, that's part of life. Suffering is part of the natural human condition. But we all would agree that there's a reasonable, normal range of suffering, and then there's abnormal, extreme suffering that's beyond what normal people endure. And would you say this taka chiyuv pir v'rivya if the child will endure unbelievable pain? And if anything, he says adarabah. If a person wanted to be meiser nefesh for a mitzvah, but his Mesiras Nefesh of the mitzvah is going to cause someone else terrible, terrible suffering. Would you say that, oh, no, go ahead, you do the mitzvah, and don't pay attention to their suffering of your fellow? Can you do so? In this case, can the father be mekayim? Does he even have the reshus to mekayim pru revu at the expense of the child who will be born with such suffering? And he goes on to elaborate on that theme a bit. Then he goes on and says, and even if you're going to want to ding zich and say, I don't like your line of thinking, I don't like your reasoning here. So he says, if so, let's switch back to the raya from the woman. We said that the woman at tsar leda, she has tsar, she can drink a kaishel likrin. She's not mitzvah. What do you mean? What about her husband? Her husband is mechuyev. Who gave you reshus to drink a kaishel likrin? So there are different people that discuss this, and it's possible to explain it in different ways. But his mahalach here is that adrabah, the husband is not mechuyev in the mitzvah on his wife's cheshbon. If his wife is suffering, the husband can say, no, I have a mitzvah, I want to do my mitzvah, because she's suffering, it's her tsar. So he's potter, or whatever, he can't go do the mitzvah. So we could apply that as well to the child suffering. Now I'm not going to go through his whole entire mahalach, he has other points as well, goes into some discussions in Achreinim that overlap, that touch on this question, or that discuss the marshal. One point he adds is that he's aware there are some very Haredi Paiskim, he quotes from Menashe Klein, the Kleisenberger, who were even unhappy with Dar Yesharim. Why are you intervening? Why are you mixing into Hashem's Cheshbonis? They take that svara to the maximum. But Rabbi Ariel says, fine, okay, no, but Rav, you'd agree that Rav Paiskim are pro Dar Yesharim. That's the mainstream, that's the majority, that's the standard approach. So once you've already opened the door to Dar Yesharim, so then you would be also open perhaps to hearing out these additional arguments that he's making in situations where Dar Yesharim isn't the solution at this point anymore. And then he points out that he's not the first person to discuss this type of thing. B'tzel Chachma, another Haredi Paisik, is matir birth control where there's concern that the child will be born with developmental disabilities, a yelid mefager, and yam shel shleima. What about the Gemara and Brachas? So the way the B'tzel Chachma explains it is that in the Gemara Brachas, it's purely about the concern that there'll be more bad people in the world. That's not your business. But the Marshal is talking about where the parents are going to suffer, the mother's going to suffer, she doesn't want to have that misery. If the parents are concerned about their own misery, then that's a better argument. It's more legitimate. There's a reason to say that she can take a kaishel ikra. He says, interestingly, the B'tzel Chachma begins by saying, most people who discuss this will say, of course you have to be mekayim priv first, the husband has to, and then we can talk about the woman going ahead. But then he says, the B'tzel Chachma adds that it could be this, if you know for a fact that that's going to be the outcome, then perhaps even if lekiyim is priv Din arvus ein choyva ala isha lidoig lekiyim mitzvahs priv shalbaila. Technically, the woman's, it's not her concern whether her husband's mekayim the mitzvah or not. She doesn't even have arvus. She doesn't have the chiyuv priv. She doesn't have arvus. So abazoi p'turim mitzvah zu. So he's even willing to. B'tzel Chachma was even willing to say that. Now, by Ariel is actually a bit comments and reacts and says, "What do you mean? Priv rivya? I mean, that is not the whole point of marriage. You're getting married for the purpose of priv rivya. She's going to be the partner." It's hard to understand how you can say that. So the Rav Ariel, but it could be Yishleimar that sure within the marriage contract there's perhaps an unspoken contract that she's here to help her husband have children, but that shibud, if you want to call it that, is the assumption was that it's a normal situation. But when you discover afterwards that there's an unusual situation which will involve a lot of pain beyond the norm, that wasn't included in that contract, the marital contract, the social contract. And since she doesn't have the mitzvah, periv, so she's not breaking anything, she's not breaking her own chiyuv, and she's not breaking her understanding with her husband if she wants to avoid having children. And he says, Shlomo Zalman is also quoted as saying that he leans towards allowing a couple that sees that there's a genetic problem, and the children will have the genetic problem. He's made to say that they are exempt from peer review. And he says more, but I'll leave it at that. And this is just some important food for thought from someone who has given the matter some thought, has written it up. Like I said, the presentation sounds a bit, perhaps a bit more contemporary in how the line of thinking is going. But we do see there are some Makairis, we saw, the Marshal, and even some other Haredi poskim today, and of course this is not medical or rabbinic advice, and in a case of a real question, a real problem, please do discuss this with a qualified rabbi. And I know we've discussed in different shiurim about paskening and who can pasken and what does paskening even mean, but I think we can all agree that a situation like this is probably ranks pretty high up there in terms of the kind of situation in which you want to psak, you want to head to, you want to discuss it with a serious rav. So it goes without saying, but we should also say it. So that was one digression from the Chalkas Yaakov. I just wanted to explore and elaborate a bit on this fascinating marshal, and often a marshal that addresses some of these more contemporary sounding questions. So back to the Chalkas Yaakov. The Chalkas Yaakov continues and says, quotes another interesting makar. There's a ritva in that Yavamas, and he says that the Birkei Yosef alludes to it. And the ritva writes, "V'asur la'adam lishtes shum davar she'yakrehu kadei lasik b'Torah." If a person wants to devote their life to Torah, and their reproductive drive is a distraction. So someone might consider, obviously we know, lahavdil and other religions, certainly we know other religions, it was much more common for those who wanted to pursue higher spiritual pursuits to avoid marriage. Perhaps not, I think we discussed earlier this year regarding tzedakah, castration, and how there is somewhat of such a concept in other major religions without getting into all the details right now. But you might find a similar line of reasoning even within Yiddishkeit. So, Ritva Bavarans, it says, Asr la'adam lishta shum davar she'yakreu kadei lasik b'Torah. But then the Ritva says something very interesting. He says, Aval lavatal mimenu taiva v'hirhur shari v'arich. If the man has some concern that the taiva and the hirhur is just very powerful and problematic, and I do want to do another digression to get into this a bit, but this is what the quote is. And so Zok the Chalkas Yaakov, this is what the Ritva says. Now, we're talking about a man, a male is certainly usher to drink a kais ikrin. Manake malkos, what the exact gather is, if the man does it to himself through ingesting something, but it's surely usher, whatever the exact issue is, it's surely usher. And yet, the Ritva is saying that there might be a heter mishum taiva v'hir. So the Chalkas Yaakov just wants to make the point and say, kol shekain for the isha, which we're talking about here, that if she has makim tsar, mutaras af lechatchila. And now he takes those words, lavat minu taiva v'hir, and he sort of uses it and flips it around. In that situation, the husband was trying to eliminate his own taiva v'hir, to apparently eliminate his own drive by making himself impotent. But here, back to our situation where the woman went to the doctor, and whatever the situation is, the doctor made a determination and said, looks like you shouldn't be having children now. And I suppose we're still talking about somewhere in the gray area. And at this point, the woman intends to follow the doctor's instructions. She doesn't want to have children. So remember how it was worded all the way in the beginning, I think even in the question by Rabbi Salzer himself, that they're not having children, so now they want a heter to have the pill so they can live together as husband and wife. Otherwise, one supposes they won't live together as husband and wife, but she's following doctor's orders. So the shaila is no longer whether we can prevent her from having children. The shaila is, can she take a kaishal ikram, but not a permanent one, a temporary one, to enable her to allow her husband to be with her? That's really the shaila. It's not a negative, it's a positive. Can we do something that will allow the husband to live with her? A husband is a man, it's just something that people experience, and they have desires, and a person's married, he has a wife, and all of a sudden she's following doctor's orders, and they're living in the same room. It's hard to avoid touching, chibuk, benishuk, which could be isr Torah, benida. So let's completely redefine the whole situation. The situation is one in which she's determined that she can't be with him. So without the pill, it seems to be assuming that she won't go to the mikveh. She won't go to the mikveh, so now he's mamish aser. And he has heard aveda b'chol yom, and it's very likely there'll be nichshol, at least in chibuk v'nishuk, touch, how long can you go? So when we reframe and rephrase the shaila this way, So Abazai, even if it's a little wrong attack on her part to go and drink the kosher liquor, let's say it's not 100% above board, but we say, you sin for your fellow's benefit. Right? Obviously, sometimes we don't say that, but sometimes we do say that. And the Chalkos Yaakov cites Taisus and Erevin. The Gemara in Erevin, Daf Lamed Beis Amud Beis, is talking about a situation in which there's a chaver, there's an Amaretz, and the chaver knows the halacha, and the Amaretz doesn't know the halacha, and there's a scenario in which the Amaretz can get the wrong idea and think that he's in the clear when really he's not, and it's really the chaver's fault. So the chaver should go and do something that really he shouldn't be doing to save the Amaretz from a bigger Isser. So the Gemara says that the Chaver can do a smaller Isser to save the Amaretz from a greater Isser. I thought, do we just say Chatei? I thought we don't say Chatei. So Zak Taisvis, two Svaras. One Svara is that here it's the Chaver's fault. If the Amaretz will be Nichshel, it will be the Chaver's fault. So therefore, the Chaver should be over on something small to save the Amaretz from something greater. And another svara in Tosfos is that Mele, if it's the other guy's fault, the Gemara in Shabbos where it says you don't say that's when it's the other guy's fault, he did the wrong thing. You don't have to come and do something small to save him. But where it's that person is completely blameless, so even if not the first svara, but just Chaveda loy pasha, amrinan chatei b'shvil sheyiska chavercha. So you have these Yesodis and Tosfos. So Abazai, we can apply that here as well, right? The woman has the problem. The doctor told the woman she can't have children. So now, either it's kind of her fault that the husband now has a Huri Aveda, or B'chad, the husband did nothing wrong. So Abazai, why should the husband have a Huri Aveda? Why should the husband be Nichshel and Chibuk v'Nishuk? She should go and do an Isser Kal of taking birth control to save the husband from an Isser Chomer. Not only that, if the husband were to be nichshel, he quite likely will be nichshel with her. So she's also saving herself from a larger isser, not just saving her husband. Now we're almost finished the Chalkos Yaakov here, basically at the end. But I want to again make another short digression to go off and discuss this ritva. That was the basis of this last part of the discussion. Levatli menu taiva vehirhu shari, which like we said, the Chalkos Yaakov flipped around and said, Ebazai, she's saving her husband from taiva vehir in another way, in a kosher way. So I just want to discuss that, the ritva and the meaning, the ramifications a bit. So just as an example, there's a tshuva in Shraga Hameir, Shraga 5 Shnebalg. This is a tshuva from Tafshin Lamed Vav, Chelik Gimel, Siman Samach Zayin, Tabletten shenasu lahachlish koyach ha'ever mutarim be'inyan sirus lazman. And it's written to a younger man, it's written in London, to another younger man, to a younger man from London. And the younger man had asked, he says, you wrote, Advar she'elascha she'muchrach at Elias parash me'ishtecha. You see, you're not going to be with your wife for a while. She's after a difficult birth. It's not happening. She has to recover. And as a very from younger man, he's concerned about what's going to be. So a person wants to take pills, tablets, to take his drive down, to minimize or eliminate his drive. So the shaila was, is there a shaila? Is there a problem? Is there a chash isser? Now this is a thorny topic, and I don't want to mention names and examples, but people have said that there perhaps are some communities that are a bit aggressive in pushing this solution on people, and it doesn't sound very ethical and very correct, and it doesn't seem like that's the kavana, the Eibishter creating human beings with their challenges. And I'm not saying, I'm not looking to go and give that an endorsement, but it is an interesting question. It is an interesting discussion, and there is a discussion about it in halacha, and it is worth to mention, to flag. So the Shraga Meir begins by quoting the Tzeditva, and he quotes it at greater length. Yivamis ma'asa shnafshi chashka b'teira, pasuk Rambam, that kol shechashka nafshi b'teira k'benazai, v'ein alav shum hirur, pater pirivirivya. Taisvis, Dr. Ritva Taisvis says that Ein B'Deiras Halalu, there's no one that's like Benazai that can claim to be like this. And here comes that quote: "V'asur lishtas shum davar shiyakreu k'dei lasik b'Torah, aval avatal mimenu taiva v'hirur shari v'arich." That quote. And then the Ritva adds, continues, "V'chin shemaiti b'shem Rabbeinu Hagadol shim kiyem mitzvahs pir v'rivya v'chash kanafshi b'Torah legamre v'reitza lishtas elecho davar shel ikur k'dei shel yizbalta mitarasai." Once you were mekayim pir v'rivya, now even Torah is your reason, is your goal, then you'd be allowed to shul mutter. Zok the Shraga Meir, Hayesha takvar kiyamtem it is periverivya sheish lecha kvar ben ubanis veish lecha chalash moed mach masaleda alkein atzman ma kadesh tachs lekeicha mutter at little dvar mavat masatayva here. So way he takes it is he says little dover lishtis dover the lavatam and tayva here shari im kiyim kormit is periverivya. So if the mitzvah was already mekoyim and now a person just wants to take his drive down a bunch of notches or completely for a good reason. So in that case, it was Torah. In this case, wife is shvach. His takeaway from the Ritva Taka is that it would be mutter to take these pills, to take these tablets. I'm not going to go through his whole tshuva, but he starts getting into, like, we're talking about mamash koshel ikrim to be ma'aka legame. He says, Lafiza, you have to find out, just clarify these pills and tablets. It's just levatel, koyach, hatayv over here, right? It's just to really bring the libido down. And we see this concept already, which obviously not in the medical sense of today, but Sefer Chassidim already says, Mi she'ein yachol is dakek and ishtei hetiv. The Sefer Chassidim is coming from the other angle, a very ancient discussion of someone who's struggling to perform properly. So he says, don't start looking for remedies that involve eating dvarim harasurim. This is just rearrange your diet in terms of dvarim hamutarim to eat things that can increase your drive and not to eat things that would decrease your drive. And he starts listing different things. Melach mevatel atayva, shumim mevatel masatayva. It's only the shumim tzluyim, only if they're roasted, that's marba hazara. So the Sefer Chassidim has this discussion about this is good, this is bad. And the Sefer Chassidim is listing things that are mevatel atayva. These are normal foods. And kumt ois in the Sefer Chassidim that stam dvarim that are mevatel koyach atayva a bit. No one said you're not allowed to eat it. So these tablets, if they're mamash mesaris, then it would be aser. The Ritva was only talking about the way he reads the Ritva. Taka was about dvarim mishem mevatlin koyach atayva here, something that would take it down a bunch of notches, and mevatlin, not miyaka legamre. That's how he understands it. And again, there's a lot more here that we're not going to get into. He goes on to say that even if we were to say that it's not permanent sidus, but if we were to say that at least for the duration of taking these pills, the person becomes infertile, that would be going too far. If it's even mesaris lazman, so that's a whole discussion in Paiskim today. If sidus lazman is aser, so he seems to be saying you want to avoid going as far as sidus lazman. You don't want to go that extreme. You want to find things that simply attack your desire and your drive, not the actual ability to have children. And then after further discussion, he concludes the tshuva and says, even though I wrote to you that if it's just mevatel koyach hatayva, you're allowed to take them, but I'll give you an eitzah taiva. Look at the Sefer Chassidim, focus on your diet, look at the foods in your diet, natural things that have a more normal, natural effect. And who knows what these pills do, what the side effects do, miyadea, what other effects it has on your body. And, that's the Shraga Hameir's maskana there. I should point out one important point, address an important point, which is Pashat Pshat and the Ritva. Those words, Levatam Menu Taiva Vehir. It seems to me, from what we've seen so far, is that there's actually a different reading in the Chalkas Yaakov compared to the Shraga Hameir. Levatam Menu Taiva Vehir, is that the reason? Is that a hemshich? You're not to drink something that will be ma'aka you if it's kedei lasik b'tayra, if the reason is for tayra, but if your reason is levatam in a tayra, then it's mutter, which is how it seems like the Chalkas Yaakov is reading it, because the Chalkas Yaakov says, leish lishtus kais ikrin asur, afilu hachi sharino mishum tayva vehira. So the way he seemed to read it was that he's drinking shum davar shiyakareu kedei levatam menu tayva vehira. Whereas it seems like the Shraga Hameir, and I think others, are reading the Ritva as alluding and talking about a new concept. It's aser la'adam lishtas shum davar sheyakareu kadei lasik b'tayra. You can't go as far as something that will be ma'akar you. Aval, to drink something else, levat memenu tayva vehirur kadei lasik b'tayra. If the outcome, the effect of the other thing you drink is simply to remove the tayva vehirur, and why were you doing that? Presumably kadei lasik b'tayra. Then it would be mutter. And then he adds and says, and if you already did perivirivia, then you can even go as far as lishtas shum davar sheyakareu. That seems seemingly like the more correct pshat, actually, in the Ritva, if we actually are asking what the pshat in the Ritva is. But it does seem like the Chalkas Yaakov read it one way and the Shraga Hameir read it the other way, which, like I said, I think is a bit more correct. At any rate, the Chalkas Yaakov was just trying to use it as a argument for a woman doing temporary birth control, Mustama, the Chakos Yaakov's argument still holds up, whether or not he can mamish use the ritva the way he wanted to. But just interesting to point out, I don't know if it's been analyzed to this extent, if anyone has pointed this out before. And at any rate, there are additional interesting shilas that revolve around this ritva. I saw someone discuss contemporary, we've quoted him before, Asher Chanan, who's an interesting fellow, discussing someone who's being nichshol in really surim, etc., etc., and can someone like that do things to eliminate their drive? And these are, of course, are very, very sensitive questions and very delicate, begashmius and beruchnius, and don't want to wade too deeply into that. But I do want to point at this mucker and point at these discussions, and sometimes the question comes up in conversation and people may not be aware that there is actually an interesting halachic discussion revolving around these points. Even from the Shraga HaMeir, you get the sense that he doesn't really think that that's the normal thing to do. As a heichatimtza, it could be that it's a heter, but as we see from the Chakos Yaakov as well, in a different context, just because something might be mutter doesn't mean that that's the right thing for Yiddishkeit. So it's a much larger, more sensitive question, b'chalal, especially when you're using it just for what are essentially normal people going through normal challenges, as opposed to something that's a little bit more unusual, abnormal. Even the Shraga HaMeir is talking about a younger man who was already Mekayim, it's his Perivirivya, and doesn't want to struggle in a situation in which he knows that he can't be with his wife. It's a bit different, it's a bit unique. And even there he says, better to go with natural and whatever that can do for you. Back to the Chakos Yaakov, and I'm going to try to keep this short. The Chakos Yaakov says there is one more opinion that we have to address. There's the Atzei Arazim. The Atzei Arazim is an interesting sefer, an Achron, who lived right before the Chassam Sefer. In fact, the Chassam Sefer quotes this makar, is mitzayin to this, and the Atzei Arazim seemingly goes up against the whole assumption that the Gemara in Yevamos tells us that women can do birth control. He says, no, it was just her decision. It looks like Rabbi was unhappy from his the punchline of the story. So, I think that if she wants to avoid Sar Leda, tifresh mi ba'ala, so you just have to stop living together and don't be over an Isser b'yadayim, but there's still an Isser in his opinion, and it would be an Isser ashchas hazera for the man if she's not able to have children. Zokte Chakos Yaakov, this is very strange. You're essentially going up against the Rambam, the Torah, the Shulchan Aruch. The Ramah didn't write a Haggah, so the Ramah is also on board. Bach, Prisha Marshal, etc. They didn't understand Pshan of the Gemara. Only you understand Pshan of the Gemara. This is what everyone took away from the Gemara. Halacha l'maisa. How can you come and say something else? You're going to say, Dim Tirtza, Li Notzel, Tifresh Mi Baila. What kind of solution is that? Among other things, Tov really the Yisr, Shal Chibuk V'nishuk, like we mentioned earlier, like that's not a solution in the Chakos Yaakov's world. Gam Hi, Gam Baila, just not to go to the mikveh. And to say that it's K'neis and Zar al Itzim Va'avanim if she's infertile, Tmuin, where does it say that it's also L'shaman Shem Isha Eilanis? Even the Chassam Sofer, who quotes the Atzei Arazim, ultimately disagrees and says that a woman would be allowed to drink a Kaishal Ikrim Askamas Baila. Sam Sefer was talking about a straightforward case. Isha mitzvah eres behiroin v'leida, ish sharila lemishti kais ikrin. And he quotes the Rambam Torah Shulchan Aruch. They all say, what about the Atzei Arazim? That's like the tshuva that Sam Sefer's premise. And the maskana there is, like the Chakos Yaakov summarizes, that he's like a paskin, that a woman's allowed to drink kais shel ikrin with her husband's agreement. And that's the psak in the Aruch HaShulchan. So if that's what they're saying about a kaishal ikrin, something permanent, so kol shekain, these pills, if it's just temporary, it's mutter. But again, back to all the other concerns, the Einei Adayin, the Brav has to agree that there is a legitimate basis, a legitimate reason. He says every dayan, he concludes, every dayan, every Rav who gets the Shaila should remember the Gemara in Sanhedrin, that a dayan should see himself like he has a knife, a sword, up to his neck, because on the one hand, you have ibud nafshis hayuludim, you're losing potential lives. But on the other hand, who knows where things can go? Things can get out of control if the situation isn't taken care of. L'famim histaf v'sakana. Hashem atoiv, he concludes, Yirapi l'kol nafshis Yisrael, beguf v'nefesh, shalom al Yisrael, and he signs, as we said, Hey Nissen, Tavshin Chav Beis, Tzidich. And he wishes him a chag kosher v'sameach. So what we've seen here, like I said, is first of all, the history. It's interesting how soon and fairly immediate it is to the arrival of this, of the pill, of the birth control pill on the market. and a pretty immediate reaction to that. The halachic discussion, of course, is very interesting, and the Makairis, some very interesting Makairis that we saw through the discussion, and just the whole presentation of how the Chalkas Yaakov tries to balance the various issues at hand. But we do see some very interesting halachic points about what basis there may be for a woman's rights, so to speak, to exert some control over her fertility, over her child rearing, her childbearing. And like we said, if a husband and wife get married, there's an understanding they'll have children. The woman to just go ahead and immediately eliminate that wouldn't seemingly make much sense. But within the realm, within the bounds of Kiyum Pir Virivia, etc., a woman actually, often in Shulchan Aruch, a woman technically has the power to even remove her ability permanently, kol shekain, if it's just temporary. On the other hand, as a community, as for Yidden, the issue of stam not to have children for no particularly good reason is a big concern, and that is something, especially within the more frum, the more haredi, the more black hat you get, that tends to be a more powerful argument, and you tend to see larger families with larger, higher numbers of children. But still, on the other hand, even within those communities, there is still a certain awareness that the concept of birth control exists, that the mother, the parents might be overwhelmed, even if it's not a sakana mamish. Again, there's this awareness that you want to have as many children as possible, but that's not necessarily, that's the whole Chalkas Yaakov's whole point, that you want to have as many children as possible, and at the same time, you still might want to pause, and that's legitimate according to the Chalkas Yaakov. I just want to reiterate an interesting point, which is, like I just said, on the one hand, it's really the woman's call in terms of her rights, the way you can phrase it based on halacha. On the other hand, the Chalkas Yaakov keeps on structuring it as the Rav has to decide, the Rav, and that's how it generally is within the starker, frimer community, which the woman shouldn't be making her own decision, the couple shouldn't be making their own decision. It's understood that the Rav should be involved and should be determining and should perhaps even name and pick a certain amount of time. But perhaps there really is a gray area in which, in consultation with the Rav, does the woman need to ask the Rav every little prat, every little detail? It's perhaps a gray area there that it's interesting to point out based on what the real Gedarim are here in terms of what the woman has the right to do according to Shulchan Aruch. Now, perhaps I would say Ad Kan, because we went through a solid shtickle, but as I alluded to in the beginning, I said the tshuva or tshuvais. So as it turns out, if you look in the Minchas Yitzchak Chelik Hey, which appears to have been first printed a bit later in Tafshin Lamed Hey, whereabouts mid-70s. So in Chelik Hey, Siman Kuf Yud Gimel, we discover that there is a tshuva from the Minchas Yitzchak, Yitzchak Yaakov Weiss, of course, who was then in London, a tshuva addressed to none other than Yedidi Rav Agoin, Rabbi Yaakov HaKohen Zaltzer, the Rav of Vadas Yeshurun in Johannesburg, dated from Yom Beis Tahara, Hey Nis and Tafshin Chav Beis. So Minchas Yitzchak wrote a tshuva to the same questioner on the very same day, on the very same topic, and I just want to mention it in short because it's mamish, like I said, same day, same topic. And he cites the question in far fewer words, although you see he seems to be quoting. He writes, "Alvar ha'ishtamshus bekadurim lahafsikas avesas l'tkufa mugbelas b'shum chalishus t'shishus koyach ayefus atzbonos." The same four terms, I believe, as we saw in the other one. So he's using the terminology of the questioner. Avalein sakana mamish, as you explained at great length. So he's a lot more to the point, both in the question, both in the presentation. And I'm going to jump to the end. Tavna Ladina, this is the Minchas Yitzchak's summary in response to Rav Zaltzer. He says, L'sabiv miniyas ha'hirdayin l'zman mugbal, mishum chalishas u'chichas koyach ha'yefes hatzmanas, all those terms you used, which you could discuss, which you could call a tsar gadol, because if you're using those hagdaras from those makairas, so it should be a tsar gadol, according to the Bach of the Marshal, one assumes. And the Minchas Yitzchak adds, and it's in large, bold letters, Lefir ois eine hamoira kedivrei hachasam sefer, alluding to that same shaila in the Chasam Sefer, the same tshuva in the Chasam Sefer in the Taka at the end. The lashon there is So he's using those terms. Some Sefer mentioned Tsar Gadol. Some Sefer mentioned the emphasizing that the Rav is a factor here. So that comes from the Chassam Sefer. The Chassam Sefer emphasizes it. The Minchas Yitzchak is emphasizing it as well. So the way he sees it is, if they were Makayim Prudavu, so then the case we just cited, all those concerns, mental health, Afshel Hater. If they were not Makayim Prudavu yet, but they have 5 sons, so he feels the bar should be higher. It has to be more Karev L'Sakana. If it's more Karev L'Sakana, Yesh Makam Lahater. Etc. And he goes on and speaks about different scenarios, different cases, different pratim. But that's the gist. So the Minchas Yitzchak, depending on factors, is also open in theory to the idea that pills, birth control, it's on the market. Women would be able to use it in situations of chalishus, teshishas koyach, ayefes, atzbonos, again, depending on the factors, depending on the Rav's oversight and input. And of course, I should point out, even in the Gemara, before she did what she did, she asked Reb Chia first. So the Rav clearly has always been a factor, and not just as hashkafa, the way the Chalkos Yaakov presented it, as deciding what the motives are and weighing the different motives and factors against each other. Minchas Yitzchak is being seemingly a little more strict in saying that essentially, hayois, we don't just go straight with the Shulchan Aruch. We have this restriction of Tsar Leda. So and within Tsar Leda itself, the Chassam Sefer said Tsar Gadol. So you need a Rav, taka to paskin if it's a Tsar Gadol or not, and especially since the Minchas Yitzchak made more distinctions between Kima Prudavu, not Makayim Prudavu. So it seems like the Rav perhaps has a stronger presence here in the Minchas Yitzchak's roadmap and version of how these halachas are applied. And now in conclusion, just for the sake of providing a somewhat clearer picture, other opinions. So there's a sefer I've come across, actually in Yitzhar Chachma. I don't know, often you find svarim there that aren't necessarily really for sale, or were for sale for a very brief time, that poor distribution. So I came across an interesting sefer, learning Hilchos Perverivya this year in Kolel. So there's a sefer, Avnei Eliyahu, by someone by the name of Rabbi Eliyahu Yitzchakov, on Hilchos Perverivya, Simonim Aleph through Vav. Huge sefer, 850 pages. And what the Sefer appears to do is that it does seemingly a really good job at systematically summarizing the discussions in Achreinim, seif after seif, subsection, sub-discussion, subtopic after subtopic. Just goes through it very, very thoroughly, systematically, and summarizes the questions and the shittas on each question in a very, very clear, straightforward fashion. So if you look in Siman Hey, in Seif Yud Beis, in Seif Yud Beis itself, what he calls Anaf Gimel, within Anaf Gimel, he has a discussion, Shitot Mini'ah Moderniot, so modern birth control. Number 1, Hagdula, the pill. And after a page in which he actually gives some technical background, he starts systematically summarizing all the various discussions in Achreinim that relate to the pill. Very organized. So, among other things, he writes, Nechlekuhu Achreinim, Masai mutter le'isha lishtamish beglulot. So he begins by quoting our Chalkos Yaakov. He says, the Chalkos Yaakov says a woman's allowed to use pills, b'makim sakana, or suffix sakana. V'chein kosav shut tzitz Eliezer, chelik tes, chelik yud, which we didn't get into, and the shut Minchas Yitzchak, which we did get into. So that's one school of thought. He writes, number 2, the other opinion is a shut igris Moshe, chelik Avinezer, chelik gimel, chelik dalet, number of simonim, who he summarizes as saying that true, he agrees that there's no issue of Zera Levatala, and if being pregnant is hard for the woman, whether illness or even Schwachkeit, more than average Schwachkeit, that would be a reason to be matir. But Rav Moshe felt that women shouldn't be using the pills due to concerns of bleeding and other complications, which may or may not have been factors that have changed over time. Obviously, we know that taking the pill still has some problems, some complications. It's not completely devoid of side effects. So our goal here wasn't to get into the Igros Moshe's particular shita, but we see that in principle, the way it's presented here is that Rav Moshe didn't have a problem in principle. And from what we hear, from what we know, within the frum world, like I said, even within the very frum world, it definitely is fairly common. A Rav will give a heter for a woman who feels overwhelmed to a certain point. I'm sure the Rav is listening out to hear whatever he is looking to hear. But that's essentially the takeaway here. And that is how he presents the shittas of the four big paiskim, Chakos Yaakov, Tzitz Eliezer, Minchas Yitzchak, and the Igros Moshe. Many other discussions relating to this topic are summarized there as well. Definitely a great resource to get all of the sugyas and shittas at a glance. And of course, there's much, much more to this topic from many, many, many angles. And everything we've said here, as is common to say, was for informational purposes, for educational purposes, to lay down a baseline of information for approaching the topic intelligently for future conversations. But of course, there's so much more to the discussion, and this is not something that people should be taking lightly. That's definitely one thing you can take away from everything that's been said, and this is definitely something that's between a couple and their Rav, and this should be taken very, very seriously. At any rate, while I hope this is not my last shiur before Pesach, and we do get to discuss some Pesach Tikkun Yonim as well, I will conclude, as both Paiskim writing on this date did, to wish everyone listening the Berchas Chag Kosher V'Sameach.